Good morning, good evening to everyone, and a warm welcome to this CDR Swiss webinar, which is today an international webinar on US policy and maritime CDR. My name is Samuel Eberenz. I'm the project manager at Risiko-Dialog, who runs the Swiss carbon removal platform, also known as CDR Swiss. Today, this is the second of a row of two webinars we have with the focus looking out of the box of Switzerland to the ocean and also across the ocean. And with these two speakers, we welcome today Frances Wang from ClimateWorks Foundation and Sifang Chen from Carbon 180. I'm very pleased to have two high-profile speakers from NGOs in the United States who really focus on carbon dioxide removal as one puzzle piece on the way towards net zero and mitigating climate change. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us from the US. And I'm really looking forward to the inputs and also the discussion. The agenda is quite simple. We'll first have an input by Frances Wang from ClimateWorks Foundations for about 20 minutes, including some direct questions we can answer afterwards. And then an input by Dr. Sifang Chen from Carbon 180 with the same procedure. After this, we'll stop the recording. You can all then switch on your microphones and video, and we can have more Q&A and discussion on the topics. I will briefly introduce the Swiss carbon removal platform before we get started. So this webinar is part of a series by the Swiss carbon removal platform CDR Swiss, with the mission of scaling up CDR sustainably together towards net zero and beyond. Our focus is on Switzerland and Swiss stakeholders, but because climate change is an international challenge, we're always interested to look beyond our borders and also see what other countries and technologies and other spheres of the world can do. In this case, in the ocean and in the United States of America. To reach our mission, we identify as a broker of knowledge, of context, of opportunities. We try to foster collaboration and synergies between members, enable exchange and networking, and involve society and societal actors with the focus on responsiveness, advocacy, transparency, and participation. At the moment, we have a bit more than 50 members on the platform from all different sectors. You can visit our website to find out more about our activities and our members. And with this, I'm very happy to hand over to Frances Wang from ClimateWorks.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really good to see everyone. My name is Frances, and I am part of the carbon dioxide removal portfolio at ClimateWorks. And in my discussion, I will talk a little bit about what ClimateWorks does and what we do on ocean CDR. And I will, in particular, discuss some of the social license analysis we've done around people's receptivity towards ocean CDR, but also the permitting and governance issues surrounding the safety and responsible deployment of the frontier research. I'm gonna move on to the next slide. So briefly about ClimateWorks, we are a climate mitigation focused philanthropy. To date, we've granted $1 billion and we do operate in 50 different countries. We are divided into 10 different portfolios, each focused on an intersection of climate. CDR is one of them. The CDR portfolio started in 2018, and we do fund across CDR approaches, so land, nature-based, and the ocean, as well as technological innovation approaches. Our goal is to support the field so that we be able to scale up to 10 gigatons of removal capability by 2050, as noted in the IPCC report. Okay, this is just a brief overview of where we work and some partners that has been working with us in different geographies on the ground. And I will provide a brief overview of ocean CDR as well, but I'm assuming that this crowd is quite familiar with the science of CDR. So ocean carbon sequestration is, in terms of the CDR field, lifetime, is a fairly new member of this field. I will go through some of the approaches quickly, but I will encourage you to read the National Academies of Sciences report that came out at the end of 2021, which goes into depth the scientific details of these different approaches. So as many of you know, greenhouse gas emissions are changing the chemistry and the physics of the world ocean, and climate change has become the largest challenge for marine biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. We know about a third of excessive carbon emissions are sequestered by the ocean, resulting in surface and eventual subsurface ocean warming, in addition to reducing the Arctic sea ice extent, rising sea levels, deoxygenation, and ocean acidification. These events and impacts tend to lead to die-off of marine biodiversity, such as corals, shellfish, and kelp, that relies on a balanced pH level and temperature range to survive. And it has been estimated that nearly all of the coral reefs will die off in the next couple decades. And it's very alarming because coral reefs are home to about 25% of all marine life. So when it comes to carbon dioxide interaction in the ocean, there's two ways. There's the abiotic pump and the biological pump. The abiotic pump, maybe not the most scientific way of explaining it, but the abiotic pump essentially leverages the marine chemistry where CO2 in the atmosphere is dissolved to react with seawater to form carbonic acid, which then increases acidity of the seawater. Most of the ocean CDR activities in the abiotic side is therefore aims to enlarge the sequestration ability of the ocean to reduce by reducing acidification. The biological pump relies on the growth and the die-off of phytoplanktons, which fixes CO2 and water using photosynthesis to create biomass. After they die, they fall into the deep ocean and is therefore sequestered. So ocean carbon removal leverages these two basic chemistries and biochemistry functions. A little bit about the current funding landscape for ocean CDR. So this is the data from ClimateWorks Foundation that we collect based on our partnership with global philanthropies in the space. And it shows that carbon removal is a very small slide in terms of philanthropic funding vis-a-vis the larger climate mitigation funding. And within this, ocean CDRs is even a smaller amount of all CDR funding, which constitute less than 1% of climate mitigation giving. The good news is when I started working on CDR 5 years ago, removal was only 2% of all climate giving, but now it's 6%. So it's really good to see the increase in funding towards validating CDR approaches. But at the end of the day, it is still a very small amount. And this gap in funding is especially obvious when compared to other ocean-focused solutions. So for example, blue carbon are things like seagrass, mangroves restoration. So blue carbon is estimated to sequester carbon less than about a gigaton per year. Comparatively, marine CDR approaches have a much greater potential to achieve climate benefits. Some estimate it to have potentials to remove around 7 gigatons of CO2 per year, but noting that many of these remains to be scientifically validated. But it is important for us to recognize that blue carbon do bring other benefits such as resilience to the community, though in terms of the marginal dollar investment into the climate impacts of these approaches, ocean CDR is still on the lower end. And this is one of the reasons that the National Academies of Sciences in the US has recommended $2.5 billion for ocean CDR research in the next decade to make up for this gap. So at ClimateWorks, we work on ocean CDR both on the science and the governance side through our grant making. And our overall goal is to incentivize good and responsible scientific exploration of ocean CDR to ensure that it has benefit for the climate and for living things. On the science side, a lot of our work helps to improve frontier scientific understanding around things like the efficacy of how quickly minerals can dissolve in the water and sequester carbon, the environmental impacts of certain approaches, such as how they would affect microorganisms or macroorganisms, and also improving monitoring, reporting, and the evaluation of the approaches to ensure that they truly remove carbon. On the governance side, we support outreach and education to policymakers, broadening the capacity of the NGO field, bolster indigenous knowledge and practices, and provide guidance with lawyers to understand the needs for at-sea permitting and evaluating the legal landscape that is needed for ocean CDR to work. So today I will talk a little bit about our work around the governance side. So I want to show you one example that we've done to understand people's perception of ocean CDR, how they conceptualize it, why not they would support something like this, and what are their concerns through this activity that we've done in early 2022 with coastal Americans. So to set the baseline, we want to understand how people view the ocean and whether they connect climate impacts to CO2 concentrations. And unsurprisingly, we found that coastal Americans are concerned about the ocean because they live next to it. They are especially worried about ocean pollution and the loss of marine life. And about half of the survey individuals are worried about warming waters and excess CO2. Now, I find the result interesting because it shows that individuals are more cognizant of the symptoms of the human impact on the ocean, but not necessarily the main drivers of those impacts. We can maybe discuss why this is the case in the Q&A, but my sense is it's because, you know, we have had a long history of observing some of the, you know, visible impacts on the ocean, like ocean plastic. So the ocean community to date has done an excellent job in communicating about the need to remove ocean plastic and about the need to protect, you know, macroorganisms in the ocean to increase biodiversity. But we have had we have had more challenge in communicating the invisible, like the CO2 impacts on the ocean. In the same survey, we also wanted to understand whether people's background, demographics, or any particular indicators would result in them being supportive or against ocean CDR. So when we break down the support for additional investments into ocean CDR research, we find that most demographics or across demographics, there is support for additional investments. But in particular, the support is strongest among Democrats and the younger generations. But overall, we are pleasantly surprised that people's concern for the ocean has led them to be supportive of increasing investment into the research. However, when we break down what type of carbon removal approaches people support, we see that nature-based solutions like forests and trees, like growing seaweed, tends to get more support. Notably, as you can see in the lower bars here, there is a significant number of people answering unsure to direct air capture and to ocean alkalinity enhancement. So this also shows that, you know, there are approaches such as seaweed, like blue carbon, that are scalable and highly desirable to people, but they don't provide as much carbon sequestration from a climate impact perspective. And those approaches like direct air capture or like ocean alkalinity enhancement that might have higher climate impacts, but is currently less known to the public. So to bring us back to the overall level of support, it kind of gives us an idea that if people visualize CDR as part of nature, they're more likely to support it. This is not surprising, but may offer some sort of pathways in terms of how we as a community can message CDR. For example, using seaweed as a way to introduce people to carbon dioxide removal in the ocean and then get them comfortable and teaching them more about, you know, some of the more difficult to understand approaches. So this then also brings me into a relevant discussion around the need to refocus science in this space. So ocean research, as many of you know and have experienced, it follows a rigorous multi-step process. Scientists often test their theoretical ideas with simulations and models, and then move on to small laboratory experiments. And when those experiments prove successful, they then try to conduct controlled small-scale trials like mesocosm trial in the ocean. And during this, you are doing this little circle between modeling, laboratory, and mesocosm to continue iterating on the research itself. And then when these prove to be successful or effective, then scientists may move into larger scale field trials. As far as the ethical approach and the responsible science goals, we feel that deployment should only occur after large trials have proven successful and is safe for the ecosystem and the people. But this also shows that the ability to conduct research in the ocean is critical in validating the effectiveness of the ocean CDR approaches. One thing I want to flag is our experience since working on this in 2019 shows that there is a desperate need for science to lead this field. And right now there is a risk of science falling behind some of the private sector ambitions. I did find that this community thus far has been operating in a collaborative, in a cautious and science-based way. but that is not guarantee of future behavior. And we have seen some poor or false signs being communicated in this space in an attempt to sell ocean CDR credits that is currently unproven. Because there's a lot of financial opportunity and demand on the private sector side to jump into marine CDR projects, we really need the resources from the public and the NGO sector, funding or capacity to properly vet marine CDR pathways. And I just want to caution that science really needs to lead in this space. And one of the ways that we at ClimateWorks have thought about to introduce and provide more guidance on how to do responsible science is through a collaborative approach to create a code of conduct or code of ethics. So this is actually a proven way of supporting frontier scientific research that may have human or environmental implications. Previously, there are code of conducts that were devised for nanotechnology, for gene editing, and for geoengineering. And ocean CDR researchers have already laid out key components that this code should include for research. These are items like transparency of data, harm reduction, assigning liability, and how to do meaningful stakeholder engagement. And these are listed on the left side of the screen. So ClimateWorks has been supporting the creation of code of conduct to form the governance basis of the field alongside with the scientific one. The first iteration is a guidance for OCDR projects by the Aspen Institute, which through a consultation process with key ocean scientists and community leaders, lays out the questions that Ocean CDR Code of Conduct should cover and seek to include. This group is now working on a draft of the actual code with legal scholars. It's also important to note that while this Code of Conduct is not and probably will never be legally binding, it is important for scientists in the public and private sector to get on the same page about research integrity in this space, especially when it comes to co-creation with affected communities and decision-making approach to minimizing harm. It is also important to use a code as a way to provide guidance and information. So for example, I've had geochemical scientists come up to me and tell me that they've been hearing about the need to co-create with communities, but they don't know how to do it. Or they've been hearing about environmental justice, but it's unclear what that would look like for their practice and for their project. So here I find the community are very well intentioned, but they do need some help. And this is an area where I feel philanthropy can play a big role, is to help communities and CDR scientists kind of connect the dots and build a capacity to speak the same language to ensure that there is responsible research. And finally, since I promised I will briefly mention the permitting landscape. So permitting is important, like I said before, because we do need to move the research from laboratory to field testing. It just helps us because we really want to validate these approaches in the next 5 to 10 years to see if it works. If it doesn't work, we should move on. If it works, we should continue to research. But it is very important from both a climate and a human timescale for us to validate these approaches quickly. Now, the current landscape of ocean governance is fragmented. How an ocean CDR approach gets permitted will depend on a few different factors. First and foremost, it will depend on what this approach is, whether you are introducing material in the ocean, what type of material it is, and whether it is above or below the water. It will then depend on who is providing the permits. This varies, depends on which country you are in. In the United States, this is currently unclear because no agency has permitted ocean CDR approaches such as ocean alkalinity enhancement before, even at the mesocosm scale. Also, sometimes the agency who control permits for above and below water activities are separate entities. So let's say that you're in a country that has worked out the agency responsibility for who to provide the permits. Now, whether your group received the permit, well, depends on the agency's ability to assess those permits. We found that often permit reviews are delayed because there's a lack of staff within those groups to process the amount of requests. And because certain agencies have to create new frameworks to assess new research requests, like many of the ocean CDR approaches, it will take additional time. And then finally, ocean CDR is also governed by several national and international agreements, such as London Convention and Protocol. Some of you might be familiar with them. These are multilateral agreements, but only certain countries have ratified and enforced them. And it should be noted that small-scale scientific research, it is often allowed under these agreements, but ultimately it would depend on how the permitting agency of the particular country you're applying to interpret the guidelines. So in area of good legal basis or framework, the permitting process can also include several steps to establish the safety and the baseline of the project. So for example, you'll be required to establish a baseline data for the ocean space you're using and provide environmental impact assessments, etc. So it will take us many hours actually to go through the details of how permitting and the legal system works for ocean CDR. So I would encourage you to look at some of the reports that were listed here that we partnered with lawyers at the Columbia Law School to examine the legal requirements for various ocean CDR approaches. And finally, so graph on the left shows the overlapping jurisdiction, as I mentioned before, which may impact permitting requests depending on where the ocean CDR is done. Now, one of the solution that ocean community, not just ocean CDR, but the ocean sensing community, observation, ocean energy and restoration community that they have came up with is a creation of a pre-permitted space. There are several benefits to these spaces, such as it helps to streamline approval process and centralize the decision-making within a single body. It also creates a sandbox or ocean space with existing baseline observational data that continues to be updated. And often to access a pre-permitted space could be less costly or reduce the duplicativeness of different proposals having to do the same data collection. So from our perspective, this is a really cool idea. It is important to conduct ocean CDR research in an area with strong legal protection to the ocean space, biodiversity, and communities. Now, some may say it's harder to get permits this way, which is true, but it helps to ensure that the research is done to the highest level of safety or in jurisdiction where actors have the ability to step in to mitigate the harm or reduce the harm if it were to occur during the research. I want to note that we must accept a degree of risk to exploratory research such as ocean CDR, but we should also recognize that the scientific community has built a lot of knowledge and experience in how to minimize some of these risks. I think that is all I have to say. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frances, for this insight and the run through all the different topics and all parts of the topics you're working on. It's really a big portfolio. We have time now for very quick, more understanding questions. You might post them in the chat, or you can also save them for later for the discussion. I think looking at the time, I would prefer that we move on to Sifang Chen, and then we have all the questions later on. As I said, after the presentation by Sifang, we'll stop the recording and have this discussion. So Sifang, I will ask you now to please share your slides.
My name is Sifang Chen. I am a Science and Innovation Advisor at Carbon 180. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Samuel and Christina for inviting me to participate in this webinar to share about U.S. federal policy landscape on ocean CDR. So in this talk, I'm going to start with an overview of the U.S. policy, federal policy on CDR in general, its role in growing this CDR industry, and then focus and look at where federal policy has acted and could act to advance ocean CDR in the US. So a little about Carbon 180. We are a US-based climate nonprofit working to advance advance carbon removal to draw down trillions of tons of legacy emissions that we have in the atmosphere. Our work is mainly focused on US federal policy, and to this end, we work closely with US policymakers, but also other NGOs and industry folks in the climate space to push for policies that can bring about carbon removal to the gigaton scale, and do this in a way that is good for people and for the environment and follows the science. So first, starting from a very high level, where does CDR fit into the US's climate plan? So first, the US has set a goal of reaching net zero by 2050. And second, scaling up CDR is included as part of the US's long-term climate strategy as one of 5 different pathways to reach net zero, alongside things like deploying renewable energy. Carbon removal is going to be important to mitigate emissions from hard-to-abate industries like non-CO2 emissions from the agriculture sector, but then also to remove legacy emissions, that is greenhouse gases that we have historically emitted since the start of the industrial era. And at Carbon 180, we really believe that this part about addressing legacy emissions is crucial, especially given that the US has cumulatively contributed the most to the emissions that we currently have in the atmosphere. And finally, the US currently leads in public funding for research, development, deployment of CDR. So in just a couple of years, public funding for CDR in the US has grown from a trickle to billions of dollars. Federal policy has been instrumental in scaling CDR, and we're gonna examine this drastic increase in funding and growth for CDR in the US and look at what this could mean for ocean CDR in the United States. So currently, carbon removal efforts in the US have been really spearheaded by the US Department of Energy. So last year in 2022, the DOE launched the Carbon Negative Shot, which is the US government's first major effort in carbon removal to help create a broad momentum and also goal setting for the CDR industry, and to also address hard-to-abate emissions and those legacy emissions. So in general, the idea of the carbon negative shot is modeled after a moonshot, where you have a very ambitious and specific target that with a specific time frame that requires sort of an all hands on deck approach to provide and create innovative technologies to help achieve those targets. So specifically, those targets for the carbon negative shot are the ones listed here. So first is to drastically reduce the cost of carbon removal to reach to less than $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. This is for both capture and the storage of CO2. And the second target is to enable the CDR industry to do this at a gigaton scale to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And finally, to be able to achieve those targets and provide durable and scalable CDR in a 10-year time frame. So in addition to these 3 targets, I think it's important to note that the carbon negative shot also prioritizes equity, community, and social benefits of carbon removal, making sure that communities, especially that have been historically harmed, are not going to be harmed again by the deployment of these new CDR projects, and that the new CDR industry could also create new economic opportunities for these communities and for people across the country. So within the Carbon Negative Shot initiative, it calls for innovations across a broad scope of approaches, including direct air capture, ocean CDR, afforestation, biomass-based CDR, soil carbon sequestration, et cetera. So these existing opportunities, but also any novel approaches that might come up in the future. So public funding for CDR in the US currently continues on this upswing trajectory. So in the most recent fiscal year 2023 appropriations bill passed by the US Congress, it provides a total of $154 million for carbon removal to support priorities in the carbon removal, including agricultural research, geologic carbon storage and permitting, and more. And also at the DOE, the Department of Energy Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, or FECM, which has really led the efforts to advance CDR so far in the US. Their CDR program also received $70 million, which is a 40% increase from their funding level in 2022. And so for this particular talk, because we're focusing on ocean CDR, I want to note that 15 million of that 17 million was allocated for research and development of ocean CDR. So like Frances has said, that ocean CDR is still a very nascent field in the CDR industry. And public funding for this emerging area is really only just starting in the US. And we have yet to see what a comprehensive and national strategy for US-based ocean CDR would look like. But as a case study, I want us to take a look at the development of direct air capture in the US, which again, just a couple years ago was only taking off. And now there's billions of dollars that have been invested into growing and expanding this industry. And hopefully this can provide a sense of what the scale of funding support for US-based ocean CDR could look like. So the policies that are listed here, so there's 4 of them that have been kind of major in terms of expanding DAC in the United States. So the first one are these regional direct air capture hubs that have been funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law that provides $3.5 billion over 5 years to the Department of Energy to develop 4 regional DAC hubs, with each hub being able to demonstrate the capacity to remove 1 million tons of carbon dioxide annually. And the second policy that aims to grow the DAC industry is these federal tax credits called 45Q. That is not just targeted for DAC, but also other types of carbon capture and sequestration technologies as well that provides tax credits for CO2 storage. And specifically, it provides $180 per ton for DAC projects to permanently store CO2. And third, there are these direct air capture commercial and pre-commercial prizes with awards totaling up to $115 million to both provide funding towards R&D of more breakthrough DAC and technologies, but then also with $100 million or up to $100 million for any qualified commercial DAC facilities. So growing the field even more and providing more funding for commercialization of DAC facilities. And finally, from the CHIPS and Science Act that have been passed recently, the act authorizes $1 billion for carbon removal RD&D by the DOE. So again, looking at this case study for DAC, US federal policy can really create a lot of momentum into growing a new carbon removal industry. And so switching gears a little bit to our focus today on ocean CDR. So Frances has brought up the National Academy's report on ocean carbon removal, where in this report, they really laid out in comprehensive, in-depth detail of the various climate and non-climate benefits and risks of different ocean CDR pathways, and what are the opportunities and challenges to advancing these pathways. And so some of the top line items here are essentially, one, that the ocean is a massive carbon sink, and that by harnessing the power of the ocean, we can help us remove ocean CDR, or has the opportunity to remove carbon dioxide at a large scale and meaningfully combat the climate crisis. And that there are many different options for ocean carbon removal, right? Including things like seaweed cultivation, nutrient fertilization, ocean alkalinity enhancement, etc. However, because these approaches are still really new, there are a large number of outstanding questions around questions of carbon removal efficacy, the ecosystem environmental impacts, what are the social benefits and risks, and also a lot of unknowns around governance, regulatory issues, and also accountability, and especially issues around monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV. And so we have, at Carbon 180, have kind of identified these 4 key challenges that faces ocean CDR today. And each of these areas create uncertainties that hamper innovations in ocean CDR. They increase their cost and also could bottleneck responsible scale up. So what are these key challenges? So first is governance. There's insufficient regulatory and governance clarity around ocean CDR. A lot of the existing governance around ocean CDR is inadequate or insufficient to address some of these concerns around ocean CDR, because ocean carbon removal was not included in these kind of governance frameworks. And second, challenges around public benefits, right? Because of the uncertainties of ocean CDR's impact on ecosystem, ocean biogeochemistry, and coastal and other affected communities, it's still unclear what are the public benefits of ocean CDR. And also there is a low currently amount of awareness and also potentially public acceptance around ocean carbon removal. And third, sort of contributing to that uncertainty is a limited or small knowledge base on ocean CDR. We currently do not have a good understanding of permanence, durability, efficacy of these ocean CDR-based approaches. And finally, there are challenges around MRV, like I said, right? Currently, we don't have the technologies, tools, and protocols to provide robust and sufficient oversight and measures of accountability around ocean CDR pathways. And that creates opportunities for potentially bad actors, for instance, to take advantage of the situation and create sort of low accountability projects. And so what are some of the federal level actions that could be done or has been done so far to address some of these challenges? So I have a list here of the sort of major US federal level actions related to ocean CDR. And many of them are still sort of focused on the research and development aspect of advancing ocean CDR. And so first, very recently announced at the end of last year, there is a funding call for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to focus on marine CDR research. So there's $30 million provided for research to understand carbon removal efficacy and also the associated benefits and risks of different ocean CDR approaches. And second, there is a program that's also recently been announced at the DOE ARPA-E program called CCO2, which is essentially a program to fund the development of new technologies and models to enable MRV in ocean CDR, with $45 million going towards advancing MRV in ocean CDR. And third, as I mentioned before, in the 2023 appropriations bill passed by Congress, there's up to $15 million directed to DOE for research, development, and demonstration of ocean carbon removal to additionally expand knowledge base in this area. And finally, currently there is an ocean climate action plan that is under development at the White House Office of Science and Technology to develop a national plan to accelerate US-based climate change mitigation adaptation solutions. And ocean CDR is included as one of those solutions that they are looking to develop. And hopefully this will also help align ocean CDR research, development, and if and when deployment happens, that it will align with broader US climate goals. And so in addition to those areas that federal policy has so far addressed, there are also other key areas where federal policy support would be really crucial. And so that in the future, hopefully, federal support will be provided to address these challenges. So for instance, some ocean CDR approaches might use have intensive use of resources and energy, right? For instance, certain electrochemical methods to directly remove CO2 from seawater, or ocean alkalinity enhancement with the need to extract a lot of minerals for OAE. And those energy and resource needs could also lead to potential environmental impacts on land, right? So not just on the ocean, but then on land as well. For instance, again, with potential for air pollution when it comes to extraction of alkaline materials for OAE. And these potential impacts also have regional impacts, right? So we have involvements from state, tribal, and local governments with their regional interests and community groups. And these concerns also need to be taken into consideration. And the federal government would have to work with these local entities to make sure that local wants and needs are prioritized and accommodated. And in addition to this, there's, kind of going back to the point on public awareness and public acceptance, and making sure that these research projects and in the future deployment are done in a responsible, equitable way. There needs to be frameworks around community engagement, ensuring equitable and just R&D and deployment in the future. And finally, because the oceans are a global commons, there's going to be issues, transboundary issues when it comes to conducting ocean CDR. So there's going to be international governance issues and global benefits sharing that will also come into play. And all of these are areas where US federal policy could provide very robust support on. And so here's a very limited list of some of the relevant federal agencies that might have some actions or aspects that will pertain to different aspects of ocean CDR. So for instance, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a nexus for US ocean research, and also has an ocean acidification program, provides monitoring tools and databases for ocean monitoring. The US Environmental Protection Agency, which has jurisdiction over projects to make sure that projects are not going to harm the environment. NASA, for instance, to provide additional tools, for instance, for MRV and ocean monitoring. And the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is in charge of projects that are deployed in the US outer continental shelf, and for instance, in charge of ocean geologic storage permitting, and also wind energy deployment, and making sure how those projects can work together, right? In the future, if there is any kind of deployment of ocean CDR projects, how would that work with at offshore energy? So these are some of the agencies that could have relevance when it comes to different aspects of ocean CDR development in the United States. So finally, in conclusion, now also looking ahead, the current level of federal funding on ocean CDR is still really low. And most of that funding so far has really focused on research and development of ocean CDR. And I didn't touch on guidance on permitting, but as Frances has said in her presentation, it is a really, really important barrier to overcome. And currently, without permitting, there is basically a bottleneck on being able to conduct these timely research field testing to validate ocean CDR methods. And of course, the US federal government can play a very instrumental role in making sure that permitting is done, it's streamlined, but also done in a very responsible way. And so in addition to that, right, federal support is going to be needed to make sure that these frameworks on environmental and climate justice, community engagement, public outreach, etc., that these responsible development frameworks are put in place for ocean CDR to advance. And like I said, with DAC development, right, that case study with the drastic increase in funding for DAC development, we can see that federal support could be key to building momentum for ocean CDR. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sifang. I think it's a super interesting mix of information the two of you gave us. Quite a dynamic field with a lot of different activities coming towards the oceans, I guess. So thanks for your inputs. I will now stop the recording, but we still have some time for discussion, and there are some questions in the chat. I also noted down some. So I'll stop the recording now.